This one graphics card costs more than most people's entire gaming PC, including mine. And it's not like it was cheap either, because this thing isn't just a gaming GPU. It was built for AI and massive servers, not just for playing games. But if it's so powerful, why doesn't Nvidia want you to know about it? Well, that's exactly what we're finding out today. This is Nvidia's $2,000 secret GPU, and we're putting it to the ultimate test to see if it can really run anything. But what even is this secret GPU and how good is it, you might be asking? Well, to quickly answer the first question, what I've got right here is Nvidia's RTX 4500 Ada generation. Not something you can just go out and buy, let alone something that you've ever even heard of before. Matter of fact, I've never even heard of this GPU until last week, despite it releasing in August of 2023, right after all the other 40 series cards. But you might be wondering how I got my hands on the thing. However, I don't think I am able to tell you without getting my channel permanently terminated. But all I'm gonna say is that I did it very legally and totally did not steal it, because that would be bad and also dangerous. Regardless, this metal sandwich launched at $2,250, and you can still find it for around $2,200 used and closer to $2,500 brand new, similarly to the 4090. What's different from the 4090 is its entire appearance. It's basically a perfect rectangle, apart from this removable bracket, which makes it very easy to hang dry your graphics card after you wash it. Being a 2-slot GPU, it's actually pretty small relative to how much performance you're getting. Including the bracket, it's about 34 centimeters long, 13 centimeters wide, and 4 centimeters tall. For my American audience who may not understand how long 34 centimeters is, it's about as long as Skelectron's forearm, 1 Lara Croft Funko Pop wide, and about 3 Skyflakes tall. And as you'd probably expect, it is absolutely one of the strongest 2-slot GPUs in the world, and 100% the fastest one I've ever had my hands on, even compared to the $4,000 RTX A6000 that I optimized for gaming 11 months ago. Although it may seem very simple and even boring from the outside because it's literally a black rectangle with a fan, what's inside the GPU is where things get really interesting. First off, it has 24 gigabytes of VRAM, and there's only one gaming GPU in the world that has more than this, so it is definitely not a joke. Now you might think that this much VRAM is completely overkill, but when it comes to doing professional tasks, it's a lifesaver. The intro for this video, for example, uses effects that cause low memory issues even with the 16 gigs of VRAM on my RTX 4080, despite it barely even using 30% of its compute power. 24 gigabytes is also huge for 3D renders, physics simulations, and AI workloads. On top of that, it has the same GPU die as the 4080, 4080 Super, and 4070 Ti Super, not to be confused with the regular 4070 Ti, which it strangely shares a lot more in common with than the other GPUs I just mentioned. And of course, sharing the same GPU die as those cards, it also has the same features as any other 40 series card, with plenty of RT cores, very efficient encoders, support for DLSS 3 upscaling, and frame generation. So if it has similar specs to the 4070 Ti, why is it so much more expensive, and why doesn't anyone talk about it? Now you might assume that the reason that the 4500 Ada is so much more expensive than the 4070 Ti is because of the VRAM. And I wouldn't blame you for that, because the biggest difference between these two cards is the VRAM amount. However, if you take a look at the current price of GDDR6 VRAM, an 8GB module only costs about $2.60. So obviously, the huge price difference between these two cards has nothing to do with the actual cost of VRAM. In reality, it all comes down to all these companies that are willing to spend this much money on their graphics cards. They would rather overspend hundreds of thousands of dollars than lose a few seconds because they don't have enough video memory. Either way, the specs sound solid on paper, but how does it perform in gaming? But the real test is getting this workstation card to work properly in a gaming setup, and let me tell you, it definitely has its quirks and issues that you would normally not see on a regular gaming GPU. For example, it disabled my integrated graphics and is completely unusable in safe mode. So I kept on having to remove and replug my display cables over and over when I first installed the drivers for the thing. But that was the most inoffensive issue that I had with this GPU. It was more of an inconvenience. But don't worry, we'll get to the huge problems with using it as a gaming GPU once we get to the pros and cons later in the video. Because now, it's finally time to put this $2,000 monster graphics card to the test and see how it stacks up against normal gaming GPUs. We're going to be testing it in 10 games at 1440p on my Samsung Odyssey G6 360Hz OLED monitor. And these are the the specs of my computer, a Ryzen 5 7600X, 64 gigs of DDR5, and of course the RTX 4500 ADA. Starting with Monster Hunter Wilds, one of the most demanding games to release in 2025, it does 91 FPS at ultra settings with DLSS balanced, and 128 FPS with ray tracing maxed out and frame generation turned on. It would be closer to around 70 FPS without frame generation, but if you have a high refresh rate monitor, this is definitely one of the games that I would recommend having frame generation on. Cyberpunk on the ray tracing ultra preset with DLSS balance gets 90 FPS, and on RT Overdrive with path tracing gets 102 FPS as long as you have frame generation. Again, it would be slightly less playable at around 55 FPS if we didn't have frame generation. Black Myth Wukong released just last year and is still an extremely difficult game to run, but gets a pretty respectable result of 51 FPS at very high settings without upscaling. Shadow of the Tomb Raider, one of the older games on the list, fully maxed with ray tracing and no DLSS, gets 133 FPS. Extremely smooth. However, this is where we ran into our first serious issue. My PC just gave up and stopped rendering the game. Not entirely sure what happened, and the only way to get out of this was to completely shut down my PC. But fortunately, it worked just fine after this, at least in this specific game. Next, in Uncharted 4 with fully maxed settings and native resolution, we get over 144 FPS. That is very impressive. In Fragpunk on competitive settings and DLSS balanced, you could easily pair this with a 540Hz monitor and still get over 540 FPS. In Marvel Rivals at low settings with DLSS balance, we are getting 180 FPS. On these settings, the game is mainly CPU based, which is why we're getting the same results as we got on the 4080 and 5070. In Ratchet & Clank with full ray tracing and max settings, it gets 117 FPS. Ghost of Tsushima gets 124, and finally for Control, we're getting 107. So as you can see, for the most part, it's getting either better or similar performance to the RTX 5070 that I tested from just last week, which is also better than the 3090. But because this is a workstation GPU, how does it stack up against a gaming GPU in professional workloads? Well, at least for Premiere Pro, it is quite a bit slower than my RTX 4080, as you would probably expect. Exporting my latest video on the 4080 at 4K only took 4 minutes and 2 seconds, but on this GPU it took almost another full minute, making the 4080 about 23% faster. That is a pretty significant difference and not something that I really wanted to see on a GPU that costs $2,200. Remember, the 4080 is pretty easy to find between $800 and $900. That brings us to the pros and cons of this GPU. Starting with the positives, it has plenty of VRAM to last several years at 1440p. Something that I can't really say about a bunch of the Nvidia cards that have been releasing recently. Basically every 70 class card apart from the 4070 Ti Super only come with 12 gigabytes of VRAM. Now that is still very good for 1440p in most games, but you have to consider that we're trying to hold on to our GPUs for as long as possible. We don't want to just upgrade every single year. And I can promise you that 12 gigs at 1440p in a few years is going to be as big of a problem as 8 gigs in 1080p right now. So the fact that this has 24 gigabytes will keep it viable for 1440p for a little bit longer. Additionally, it's a very new graphics card with all the Nvidia features. And of course, it's going to fit in a lot of PC builds because of the very small form factor. However, the cons may outweigh the pros on this graphics card. First off, it has incredibly bad price to performance because companies are willing to pay so much for it. So it's not really a problem for them, but if you're just a regular person looking for a graphics card, this just makes no sense. It also has a lot of bugs and lacks game-ready drivers, so only studio drivers are available. You are going to get a lot more stability on studio drivers, but again, we did see some issues on the latest ones, so they're not really doing what they're supposed to. And probably the most annoying problem with this thing is that the coil whine is incredibly loud. Obviously, I play games with headphones connected, and you can hear the GPU through the freaking headphones. You're gonna get this with most GPUs, but on this one, it's completely different. It is so much louder. You won't really hear it when you're just browsing Google, but once you open a demanding game and uncap the FPS, it becomes so incredibly loud, it's literally like, I don't even know, bro. Like, I can hear it louder than my game sometimes. So after spending all this time with the RTX 4500 ADA, it can run everything I throw at it, and in a lot of cases, it performs better than a lot of respectable graphics cards out there. But that doesn't necessarily mean you should ever actually buy one. The price to performance is awful compared to a 4080 or 4090. It gets the same performance as a $500 RTX 5070, and for the same price as the 4090, you might as well get the 4090, which has the same amount of VRAM, but significantly better performance. Regardless, I think it's crazy that Nvidia has this $2,200 secret GPU hiding in plain sight, and now you know exactly why nobody knows or talks about it. But something you definitely want to know is how I turned a $20 Chromebook into a Windows 10 gaming PC. So if you want to find out how I did it, watch this video next.